Welcome to What's Not Priced In, a weekly investor podcast by Fat Tail Investment Research. In a world of confusion and rapid change, experts Kirill Prakapenka and Greg Canavan look behind the headlines to unveil the hidden opportunities within the Australian stock market. Now, let's dive into today's episode.
Senator Alex Antich, thanks very much for joining us today.
Greg, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So we're here to talk about Australia's energy transition, and it does feel like the tide is turning a little bit in terms of public support for the energy transition. Previously, as we saw in the election last year, it was very widely supported. Climate change seems to be a big concern for the electorate, but we're now seeing the costs of that come through, and the tide is turning, I think, in terms of the public opinion. But you've been against this for some time, so maybe we could just start with your position on this and why you have been a critic of the energy transition from the start.
Yeah, look, I have, Greg, and thanks. It's a massive topic, isn't it? But it is probably as central to the Australian political debate as anything is at the moment for a range of reasons. I mean, at least the first one would be the cost of living issues. I think this, if anything, could be centred on one of the main sort of drivers of the cost of living crisis. I think it's probably this one. It sort of fuels everything, doesn't it? The cost of energy. It's sort of, really the apex of it all. So it's a massive issue. It's one that sadly the other side of the chamber in this place here say, the kind of call it the kind of climate wars. I always say, they started it. It's like defending a stable, cost-effective and reliable grid really shouldn't be seen as being something that's a luxury. It should just be something that people take for granted. Certainly when I was a kid, when I was a boy growing up in the 80s, I never really thought about this sort of stuff, and no one did. Power was cheap. The lights almost never went off. And so it always struck me politically what it would take for people to understand the damage that's being done to the Australian economic situation and the energy infrastructure almost by stealth under the cover of this, this kind of climate alarmism. And I think sadly, and I really don't take any joy from this at all. In fact, quite the opposite. I think that the rising cost of power is going to be the thing that's really going to drive this. Around this place, I don't know. I feel as though sometimes this building, and I say it all the time, is a little bit like, they call it a bubble, Canberra and Parliament House, but it's more like a concrete reinforced bunker. The sort of real world issues and the fact that cost of living issues are biting sort of is only just breaking through the surface here. These issues, I think they frighten people off. The scare campaign on climate has been so effective over the last probably almost 15 years now and more, that it's a real scare for politics. But I am sensing, as you said in the intro there, I am sensing that the sands are shifting a little bit, and I think that's economic driven. I think that it has to be. It always is. People's back pocket is the thing that will motivate their interests and motivate their voting patterns. So we've got to push on. We've got to push away from, continuing to destroy the grid.
And you mentioned there the cost of living, and we just saw with the inflation data that came out just last week, it showed that electricity costs increased by 6% in the month of July alone, and that would have been nearly 20% if not for the subsidies that have been paid to try to keep those costs down. So clearly this stuff is starting to bite. From a politician's perspective, what are you hearing from the person on the street? Is this becoming more of an issue? Because as you said, the basis of politics is the middle class being squeezed, and cost of living issues are always at the forefront. And I think this is the trigger that is going to get people waking up to the fact that this is going to be a very costly transition, and the government won't be paying for it. It will be the people that eventually foot the bill.
Yeah, look, I think it is. Certainly people I speak to are starting to, really make these points. They have been for a long time, though, when you think about it. We were hearing about the radical increase in cost of power more than 10 years ago, and we were all feeling it as well. But it does feel like over the last 6 months, 12 to 6 months, things have really, really exacerbated. And, I think the sorts of savings nest eggs that businesses were keeping and that people were keeping are now starting to sadly dry up as a result of all these cost pressures. And they are starting to poke their head above the parapet in terms of a political issue, sort of an on-the-street political issue. Around where I live in Adelaide, I I see a whole heap of climate action now signs on the, on fences. Very effective campaign that's been sent out into those suburbs. They're nice suburbs. They're relatively kind of well-to-do, middle class, but nice places, and they are all I think in a sense I think they feel like they're doing the right thing. They've all believed that we're somehow in the middle of a climate emergency and we've got to act, but it's a question of how long it takes for those signs to come down and for people to join the dots. And that's the job of people like myself. And, I suspect that some of the work you're doing as well is to try to show people the very real back pocket cost of what we're doing. Professor Plimer made the point when he came and spoke to me recently that this was a little bit like the tulip bulb revolution in Holland in the 1600s, I think it was, or thereabouts. I probably got the dates wrong. It's the same principle. I said to him, where do we go now if we continue to find this? And he just said one word: bankruptcy.
And that's clearly the way we're going, and we'll get to maybe some of the discussion about the economics of it shortly. But I first wanted to just ask, or if you could give us some insight into the politics behind this, because we are going down a hugely expensive path. And if we look at the history of energy transitions, normally the market drives those transitions, and it's driven by a need or a desire to move to more efficient energy systems. And we are effectively backpedaling here and moving to a more inefficient system of capturing energy via renewables, which are intermittent. You have to build, obviously, extensive transmission systems to capture and distribute that energy. It seems like we're going down this path without a rational debate about the costs of this. And the debate always centers around an emotional debate about a climate catastrophe, and we have to do it at any cost. And that's ignoring the fact that Australia's emissions are so minuscule on a global scale that it doesn't really matter what we would do, and it's not going to change the climate on any growth. That's assuming that you believe in man-made climate change anyway. So I guess my question is, why are we not having this debate, and what is the agenda behind this sort of mad push to renewables without considering the cost?
Greg, that's a great question. That's a question I've asked myself on a range of different issues, really in politics for the last decade or more. I think we've seen this sort of pattern of issues that once would have created this kind of national debate, and things would have been picked over properly and analysed, and come to a sort of a conclusion, a sensible or otherwise, I suppose. But at least we would have debated it. We don't see that anymore in politics. And I was only talking yesterday to a colleague here about my frustration with legislation that is just basically slipped under the rug. I think about, there were some social policy issues in South Australia that were done in that manner. They were, literally just tried to, be kind of pushed along without too much debate. I think this one is a bit like that as well. The media has driven it. There's obviously big money involved in this transition, this kind of wealth transfer from different types of energy production. So there's that issue as well. But I think it's bigger than that. I think if from a society point of view, people aren't interested in debating as much as they are feeling these days. And I think so much of our decision making, so much of our public discourse now is about how it feels. There'd be one school of thought, I suppose, if we were getting right into the sociological weeds on this, that would say this is a product of the school system. I think probably when people like you and I were in primary school, there was at least some, I guess, discussion about rational thoughts, and I don't really know exactly the details of what goes on school floors now. But what I hear is that, in many instances, kids are really being promoted as being activists. And I guess that generation has come through into the university era, and many of them now probably are even in the corporate world and are voting age and are whatever. So I'm concerned about the sort of stuff we're feeding in through the school system that's created this world where people are not interested in debate anymore. There's this whole, and I'm sure you get it as well, there's this whole feeling that if you are even willing to question the narrative, then you're somehow a bad human being. I mean, I remember that from 10 years ago when I went on the Adelaide City Council, and it was all about renewable pushes and trying to find ways to spend ratepayers' monies on solar rebates and cycling and all this sort of stuff. I mean, it was a great big political statement more than anything. But if you were one of the people that stood up and said, hang on a minute, let's just look at the numbers, you were immediately shouted at and called all sorts of names. And that's sort of what we've got in politics today. It's too easy for the mob to shout down those that are willing to speak against it. And that's a position for the general public. The general public has to get on top of this. We have to help them get on top of it, and we have to help them understand and make the connection between this push into renewables and their high energy prices, because really there is no argument about that.
Absolutely. And look, your point about the education system, I think, is a fair one. And even in higher school education, there's not a lot of discussion around simple concepts like cost benefit analysis and things like that, which goes to the crux of this. I asked before, is there an agenda at play? Because if I wanted to destroy a country, I would destabilize their energy system. I would make it unreliable and I would make it very expensive. And it just seems to be completely insane that is what the political class of this country is essentially doing under the guise of doing the right thing. So I think it's a legitimate question to say, is there an agenda at play here? Because it just seems so absurd when you look at the numbers and when you look at it from a rational perspective and take the emotion out of it.
Yeah, and look, I really, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? I mean, if you wanted to weaken an enemy, you could start by weakening their manufacturing and their self-reliance, and I have said in the chamber recently that I believe that the Chinese Communist Party have a hand in a lot of these ills that are in our society. You only have to look at the way in which they use social media against the West, children of the West, by virtue of the way they use it, or comparatively to the way they use it in relation to their own youth. And to see that feels like an attack. They have their fingerprints all over the drug trade, the fentanyl trade in the US, and some of that here too. And if I were a cynic, I would say that the United Nations, the International Panel on Climate Change, do play a very large role in the narrative. And I don't know. I just don't know what the play is here. But what I do know is that it is weakening the Australian economy, and that is a bad thing. We need strong energy production, as I said, just domestically, but also from a manufacturing point of view, and everything leads from there. I mean, we really are very, very vulnerable from a strategic point of view as a result of this. So, look, I don't know where that comes. I think it's probably a multitude of factors. I think on a political level, here, I think people are playing to the crowd. I think a lot of politics is, there'd be people in both houses here and in other parliaments across the country that don't think this is really as big a problem or a problem at all, and that we're approaching it the right way, or a combination of those factors, but are still going along with it because they think people are with them on the street. So, I think a lot of the onus here is on the education process outside and making sure people are across the problem. I don't think people see it still yet.
And I think it's a good point, because if you look at what's happening in Victoria have just banned gas in new builds, I think from next year, which puts more pressure on the electricity system because more people will go electric. And at the same time, Victoria wants to take away its coal-fired power station. So I just looked at the numbers this morning, and over the past 12 months for the NEM, the National Electricity Market, over the past 12 months, coal and gas supplied 63% of the NEM's electricity needs, and solar and wind, on the other hand, supplied just 22%. We are meant to be, or under the government's plans at the moment, we are meant to be at 82% by 2030. So what we've got is a situation where we're encouraging more electricity demand at the same time as we're trying to cut supply. And it seems to me that there is not a chance of building the renewable infrastructure that we need in order to get anywhere near that 80% supply. Again, are people not discussing these basic facts in Parliament and saying, look, there's not a chance that we're going to get here? I mean, Chris Bowen, who's the climate minister, he constantly just trots out the renewables, the lowest cost form of energy, and we've just got to work harder to get there. And it just seems that it is almost impossible, and we're not discussing this absurdity of a target at the same time as we're trying to increase demand and cut supply.
Yeah, and I mean, we saw that in California, I think 9 to 12 months ago, where there wasn't enough power to power all the electric cars, I think it was, or there was a shortage. They were having blackouts over there several times. and yet the government was telling people to go and buy those vehicles, EVs rather than petrol driven. And I don't know. I think the part of the problem is that it is very complicated area on one level. I think the actual into the weeds on this energy issue is a really, really detailed, difficult experiment. But the actual nuts and bolts of it are very, very simple. And the simple facts are where renewables go, power prices increase. We know that. And so I don't know. I think you asked the question, is that being prosecuted here? Yeah, there are some. There are some of us that will talk this language, from everywhere, from, Senator Matt Canavan, who's been, like a outspoken critic of the net zero agenda, even when it was our side of politics that were pushing it. I mean, I just don't have any time for the concept of net zero. It's not a real thing. The whole concept of reducing emissions like that really comes back to lining the pockets of, European elites and kind of the green carpetbaggers of the world. I just doesn't make any sense for Australia. If your mission here is to put Australia first, then that just doesn't make any sense. And you're spot on. I mean, we simply can't do it. It's absolutely extraordinary that it's not being put out in those terms. The other thing we haven't talked about, but I think that is important, and I think it's why it's so important that we have people doing the sort of stuff you're doing and others are doing in the kind of independent space, is that we don't have the mainstream media who are talking about this stuff in the way they used to, frankly. I mean, you get snippets of it, but the main hardline media, the sort of the mainstream media are just not talking about it, not doing their due diligence on the numbers. I mean, these should be national scandals, this sort of self-harm of the energy grid. And yet, we seem to have feel-good stories about families that are putting in solar panels and dropping their prices. And, I mean, that's great for them, but there's a bigger political issue at play here, and it just, as you say, it seems to be drifting through, and there's a sum of its parts. I think ultimately it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and we're just not addressing the problem. And all of this for what? We're 1% of the world's emissions. It just doesn't make any sense.
Exactly. You mentioned net zero before, and the fact that it's just a bit of a pipe dream. Let's just put that aside for 1 minute and assume we continue down this path for at least the next 10 years. What does the approach to net zero look like for the Aussie economy? Like, where do you see things going? And I asked that question to sort of wonder, at what point does the electorate really wake up and start to resist this? Because I spoke to Ian Plimer about it, and he said that we will have to have a crisis before people wake up and understand what is really happening. Just wondering what your views are on that.
Yeah, look, I mean, sadly, I have long held that view myself as well. I don't think, it comes back to this issue of helping people join the dots on and making the correlation between high power prices and high, renewable uptake. So I sadly, I tend to agree with him on that, but it's got to be our job in politics to push this as much as we can. It has to be, the message has to be there to be sent out. And, I think we're increasingly seeing that. We do have, I think, held the line last term with the Morrison government. I think there was some really good stuff that was done during that period. But, ultimately, we're sort of in a position now where we have to just take the bull by the horns. If I had my way, I'd be building cheap coal-fired power everywhere, just like the Chinese are doing. By the way, the Chinese Communist Party are building hundreds of them. And over the last few years and continuing to do that, and their power is low, their manufacturing is high. But I just, once again, I think this is such a difficult issue, or the perception is that it's such a difficult issue. It's not being talked about enough around the dinner table, because people have to make that connection between their power bill and what's being done. Because ultimately, you're quite right. I mean, to push towards net zero means this is not going to get any better, and yet the irony is there are ways to do it, nuclear power being one. There's a long run up to that. There's a whole heap of issues there, probably a different subject again. But, renewables are not going to get us there without, as Ian Plimer says, what would it look like if we continue down this path? I asked him. He said bankruptcy.
So you mentioned before it needs to become a bit more in the public consciousness and around the dinner table. And a lot of that comes down to leadership. And when you do get genuine leaders, people follow and people sit up and take notice. So question is Peter Dutton a genuine leader on this issue for the Liberal Party to provide an alternative path?
Yeah, look. I really think you'll find that he's doing some great work at the moment. I mean, we talk about this all the time here in Canberra, and one of the things I've been really pleased with about the stuff that Peter's done has been the opening of the discussion on nuclear. And I don't know where it heads, but it's certainly a very welcome and positive thing. I have to say, I talked about it in my maiden speech to Parliament. Been a long time advocate of at least exploring it, at least talking about it. You know, those voices are there inside the party room. I think the Liberals and the National side, and there's a real willingness to do it. And I think there's a willingness in the community to understand it now. I guess, probably my generation, I'm 48 and above, still have those images of Chernobyl. We're probably old enough to remember Chernobyl and, even Fukushima, but the younger generation are really across this and, of course, are very attuned to the issues of climate change and, so I think are primed for this discussion. And as people would well know, it's really just a simple legislative amendment. Really, there's a couple of lines in two different pieces of legislation. The main one is the prohibition in the Environment Protection Biodiversity Act, and that is a simple line which prohibits the generation of electricity from nuclear power. Now, what does it look like in the long run? Well, that's a great question. I mean, the argument that's always thrown back is that it's not cost effective. And that may well be with small modular reactors and Generation 4 reactors. It may be or it may not be. My view is we let the market decide that, as we should, and we get out of the way and let the market show us. But one thing that's certainly clear is that many countries are adopting the kind of light water style, the previous generation, as a sort of an interim measure. And that doesn't have to take as long as they say. The other argument is that it'll take 20 years. We don't have the expertise. Well, we've got the AUKUS deal now. We've got nuclear subs coming. There's a huge opportunity, particularly for people like us in South Australia who sit on all this uranium and this stable geology. We should be digging this stuff up, using it for electricity generation, and then storing it as well. And really, there's the economic opportunities from that are almost limitless.
Well, the whole idea around nuclear is that it's emissions free.
That's right.
So it seems, again, absurd that this is not being considered as a viable long-term solution if everyone is so concerned about the climate catastrophe, that this is not a viable long-term solution. I guess that raises the question, why is the Labor side of politics so against it when it is clearly something that can do the job? And if you look at nuclear energy, just in terms of the physics of it, it's the most efficient form of energy that we've got. Nuclear power plants can last anywhere from 60 to 80 years. And the other part of this discussion that's never really talked about too much is that by the time we roll out our first lot of solar and wind farms, by the time we get to 2050, when we're supposed to be net zero, a lot of those will need to be replaced because they'll have reached the end of their working life. So these comparisons with nuclear versus renewables are, again, I think, tainted or tilted at least by the lack of taking those things into account. So it just seems absurd, again, that we're not talking about this as a serious thing. And back to your point earlier, where people are worried about things like Chernobyl and Fukushima, if you educate yourself on nuclear energy, you'll see that they were not necessarily catastrophes purely because of the power plant. Chernobyl was very poorly managed, and Fukushima was contained, even though there were some issues around the very small containment area. Over the life of nuclear energy that we've had around the world since the post-World War II, I think there's been very few deaths to do with nuclear energy. Whereas if you talk about deaths from coal mining or from a range of other things, that it's off the scale. So again, we are not having rational discussions about this. We're having emotional discussions, which are to the detriment of our long-term prosperity.
Yeah, I mean, the first question there was, if people are serious, if we're in a climate emergency and nuclear power provides an emissions-free and effective way of addressing that, why aren't we doing it? Well, to me, that's always been the issue that's belled the cat on the entire climate change debate, this is really an ideological debate. This is really about the left getting its way and this transition to renewables being completed. And, as you said earlier, I mean, we don't know what the motivation for that is. I think it's an ideological one that, the left play this ideological game. Is it's my way or the highway, and there's no room for negotiation. That's just sort of printed in the DNA, I think. But it really does make the point very clearly that we could be doing, we could be addressing this without without their renewable plan and the sort of cost structure that goes with it. It's not cheap power. I mean, this is the myth that's peddled all the time by the proponents of renewable energy, people who tell you that it's the cheapest form of power out. Well, it is once it's in, because it's free to get the power from the sun and the wind blowing, but the capital costs associated with putting them in, and as you say, and as Ian Plimer says all the time as well, the replacement costs. He points out that solar panels have a 20-year lifespan, but in reality, most times, if you're getting 12 to 15, you're doing well. And then what? What do we do with them then? So there's all sorts of problems that aren't being debated. A simple cost-benefit analysis, which any journalist that's straight out of university would do this, but that discussion just doesn't seem to be happening. And outside the sort of the small fringe of the conservative media in this country, anyway. The answers are all there. I just sometimes wonder whether or not the proponents of this really want a solution to the problem, or whether they want their ideological agenda to just live on. I mean, without the ideological agenda, if you get a solution for something, then you've got to find other issues to fight on, and then you lose relevance. And climate change has been a massive vote winner for the Australian Greens across the country. So, sometimes you have to wonder. Yeah.
It's the gift that keeps on giving, and certainly there's a lot of people on that gravy train doing well from it as well. Final couple of questions. In terms of the coalition, obviously the Nationals must be quite involved in this from the perspective of the transmission system that needs to be built across, extensive networks of farmland and stuff like that. What's and I know you're a Liberal senator, not a part of the Nationals, but what's the sort of vibe on that front? Is it because everyone in the renewables industry talks about trying to get social license to get this done, but I'm hearing a lot of pushback is happening from the farmers who don't want the transmission lines across their land. What's your view on that?
Well, look, I mean, I interestingly, I listened to not a national senator, but Senator Malcolm Roberts from One Nation talk about some of this, putting out of transmission lines across virgin bushland in Queensland, this sort of almost decapitation of sections of the mountain. And, it sort of dawned on me how the politics is really a myth. Like the myth is that the conservative side of politics are, all for big business and all anti-environment, and we all want to see, natural forest being chopped down and, oil pouring through the streets, and we're all terrible people and all that sort of stuff. That's what the left will have you hear. But in reality, these transmission lines that are being built are scarring the landscape, removing the habitat for local wildlife. And it took Conservative Senator Malcolm Roberts to point it out, while the Greens were cheering for the destruction of native habitat and the wind turbines that are basically bird choppers. I mean, politics is just completely on its ear at the moment. I don't. It's very hard to work out who's where and why. And it's almost as though the left are now the establishment and are fighting on the front lines with the big corporates who are doing this sort of stuff. Look at the COVID period where the left were cheering on Big Pharma, which is just completely incongruous to me. I could never understand how we'd come that far. Well, we're sort of seeing the same thing now. We've got the Conservative senators that are pushing for conservation. And I've always had the view that the right of politics are the genuine conservationists. Most of the most ardent conservationists I know are members of my party, who are farmers, who are people that live on the land, and are surrounded by the natural habitat. And yet the left seems to have claimed that line. I think this transmission line issue is building in the same manner. And I think the pushback we're going to see about this is going to come from the conservative side of politics.
It's funny you mentioned that. You were saying before you grew up in the 80s. I'm around the same age, just recently turned 50. When I was young, rebellious kids were rebellious. Kids these days are anything but. It's everything has flipped on its head completely. Final question. We're still a couple of years away from an election, but given that obviously there's going to be a big lead up to it, do you think this energy transition will be the defining argument over this election, and whoever has the policies to at least give some sort of not resolution, but some sort of I guess way for the electorate to potentially do a little bit better from the cost of living that they will be experiencing in the coming years. Is this something that the coalition is going to take to the election in a big way, do you think?
Yeah, look, I'm sort of guessing. I don't know. I mean, I had that discussion with Peter and the leadership team, but I think so. I mean, it's clear. I've been saying for the last forever, but certainly in the last 12 months, that really the three issues that face this country are all E's. They're the economy, they are the education, which I think is a massive issue. We sort of touched on that earlier, but also energy as well. It's those three E's, and energy and the economy are sort of interlinked. But I think these are the battlegrounds on which we fight and win an election. Mainly because I think there really is a bit of correlation between all of them. We need that education system fixed so that kids aren't getting brainwashed, so that we don't have this nonsense narrative that you're not here to learn, you're here to learn how to be an advocate. That's just not helping us, and it's feeding into all sectors of our world. And we're seeing effectively, I think, kind of a political socialist takeover of this country, which I never thought we'd see, and I think it's getting very, very unsettling. But ultimately, the cost of living issues are the main issue. They should be the main issue at the moment. And look, once again, I think we just have to make the case for joining the dots on the cost of living issues and the energy transformation. My view is, and I'm no economist, but it is the central issue for us in terms of the driving up of the cost of living. Obviously, there are global factors as well, but I think the energy transmission and the sort of reckless stuff we've seen out of the Biden administration, shutting down the Keystone XL pipeline, amongst others, almost this war on fossil fuels that we didn't see under the Trump administration, are really the driving factor in a lot of these cost of living issues. So we've got to address those. And I would love to see us take, and I'm not preempting this, but I would love to see us take a sort of a nuclear policy to an election. I think it'd be a winner. The Minerals Council continue to tell us that the mood out there in the electorate has changed, and my view is, politics is about leadership. Whether it has or it hasn't, we've got to find another way to return cheap power to the grid. And I think it's a debate we have to have. And let's see. I think the Australian people are learning very quickly about how reckless this government's been.
Absolutely. Look, on that note, I think we'll leave it there. Alex Antich, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Greg. It's been great to chat.
Thanks for joining What's Not Priced In, your weekly source of unique ideas in the Australian stock market. Now, if you've enjoyed this episode, please show your support by liking and subscribing, and turn those post notifications so you don't miss a thing. And stay tuned for the upcoming episodes as we delve into new topics, new trends, and new stocks. Thanks for your support. Hope to see you next week.